Namaste. Good afternoon, one and all. I welcome you all for the fourth session of the course, Sense of Past towards Realizing Rāma Rājya. Pranavji, you mentioned about your mentor and a great scholar, late Professor Navjoti Singh Ji. Today happens to be his birthday, and I would like to know a bit about Professor Navjoti Singh. I think you can mention a few, his ideas, his works, and how his ideas inspired you as personally and overall, the formation of the Purnam Pramati's ideas. Maybe you can speak about Professor Navjoti Singh for a few minutes, and then you can continue with your regular course. Over to you, Pranavji.
Thank you, Sanjeev Avaru. So today happens to be the today some of you would be aware that there is also the National Science Day, the birth anniversary of Sir C.V. Raman. It also happens to be the 63rd birth anniversary of late Professor Navjoti Singh, who was one of the key inspirations behind the founding of Purna Pramati. There are a few points that come to my mind whenever I think of Professor Navjoti Singh. First, let me give you a glimpse of his web page. This is I hope you are able to see Professor Navjoti Singh, a very lively person. In his short lifespan of 60 years, Professor Navjoti was very keen on trying to bring to the fore the manner in which one could as well think of looking at Indian past in ways in which we respect the glorious learning tradition of our country, and in what manners could it be brought to contemporary relevance. This was one of the key aspects that Professor Navjoti worked on, and he did his undergraduate study in mechanical engineering from IIT Kanpur, and right after his BTech, he continued at IIT Kanpur to do his MTech in nuclear engineering, and right after this study of nuclear engineering, he found himself amongst the first few scientists working at Bhabha Atomic Research Center, where he got to rub shoulders with one of the legends from the Karnataka scientists, Sri Raja Ramanna. And he stayed there for a couple of years, but right throughout his stay at BARC, his keen interest was in terms of trying to work on Indian darshanas, and specifically he was very fond of study of Vaiseshika Darshana, and that has been a kind of his focus. So there's a very fine story that he used to share that Dr. Raja Ramanna used to tell that Sardarjis cannot study Shastras, and Professor Navjoti responded saying that, well, I trace my lineage to Kshatriyas from so-and-so region in Rajasthan, so I should be able to study. And he quit Bhabha Atomic Research Center, and he wrote a paper. I'm actually showing you a page. I guess there is some problem in here. Yeah. So he wrote a work where his study was on actually the kind of mathematics, the foundations of mathematics in the country which was his first work, a comparative study of foundations of mathematics in India, China, Greece, and modern West. So when he actually sent this paper, he was invited to join the CSIR organization called National Institute for Science, Technology, and Developmental Studies in New Delhi, where he spent the next 30 years or so. In fact, his engagement on for the next 20 to 25 years, he was with Nistats, where his focus was on studying Vaiseshika and its corresponding relation with the contemporary studies. And he has had forays into a number of areas, and one of his key insights was to pick a problem from within the Shastra and to try and give it a specific orientation in the contemporary scenario. And he saw that the way in which the commentorial tradition in the Indian Shastras has been constructed is such that it did indeed address the kind of issues that people in those days faced, while at the same time furthering fundamental advancement in the very study of the Shastra. So such was the kind of formation that he did. And he also was very keen on actually raising questions about the foundations of thought in each and every realm of humanities. So he strongly believed that the separation between science and humanities is something that is unknown to Indian mind. He was a very active member of a group of scholars from the IITs called the Patriotic People-Oriented Science and Technology Group. So this group worked on a number of things. Amongst others, it was one of the first concrete attempts at trying to bring out what they called as traditional science and technology in India. And during the 1990s, these PPST group organized very huge melas called the Traditional Science Congresses across the country, wherein they documented a number of Indian science and Indian technologies, and also brought out what is the difference between what is being practiced and that is in vogue, which is owing its roots to Western science and technology, and how is it that it contrasts with that of the Indian approach to the question, as well as to the nature of technology that is there. So that itself opened up a number of things, and he felt strongly that the kind of activity that we keep doing is something that we focus on science as something which is treated as equivalent to that of Shastra, which it is not. So he was very keen on contrasting between science and Shastra, and how is it that one can speak of Shastra in current times. And in order to speak of Shastras in the university atmosphere, he founded a research center by name Center for Exact Humanities at IIIT Hyderabad in 2008. And that work on the Center for Exact Humanities was a seed where at the university level a CEH was imagined, and at the school level a similar kind of a requirement was felt by my friend Srinivasa, who thought of a CEH at the school level, which was the seed one of the seed ideas behind founding of Purnapramati. You would find that, say, here there is an article, Sense of Past, Itihasa versus History, which is a point that we shall discuss as a part of today's lecture. So there are a few points that I intend to bring to your attention. We have till now seen a few points about the nature of time. There are a few things that we haven't completely captured within the notions of time that we are presented with. And there's a very specific reason that we couldn't do it also, because the scope of what one can do within the entire range of things that one finds within time is immense. But there are enough indicators that we have covered for us to move further in terms of trying to see what we can do with the course. And I intend to bring to your attention that when we start discussing about the time, we've already made a few kind of forays while actually referring to the kind of eschatology. So when we actually refer to eschatology, we clearly made a mention of heaven or a hell. So that certainly is something that is a space which is distinct and different from that of the kind of world that we reside in. And in our traditional parlance, we refer to this as Ihaloka and Paraloka. So the fact that, say, there is this distinction between Iha and Para is a key point that we indeed have to notice. So we'd as well try to see where does this indeed lead us to. So on one count, we have the point of reference in terms of a world which is this one that we see. We are aware of when we refer to space in current times, in scientific terms, one refers to the vast universe with the kind of galaxies, stars, planets, and so on. So this kind of conception is something that has parlance that one indeed finds when it comes to our own thought processes in Indian tradition, where you do find that there are different kinds of worlds that are spoken of. So the nature of space that one speaks of isn't something that is restricted, or is it something that constrains itself. We speak of 14 different worlds. So what are these spaces is a question which is elaborated, that one does find in our Puranas, where there are a number of descriptions. But more importantly, the distinction between this world and the other world is a fundamental factor that we actually come across in all religions. The very fact that there is the other world that is spoken of is something that is at the core of trying to speak of the nature of action that human beings do in the present. So this is something that we must keep in mind, and we shall certainly try to work out the way in which one can think of the other world. And there are specific references that Professor Navjyoti made, which I also shall be discussing with you as a part of this today's exercise. Apart from this, when one refers to space, I have already indicated to you earlier that a space, when given a name, becomes a place, and the moment it has a name, that name itself brings along with it a great degree of stories, a great number of values, a great number of ideas that are carried within that name itself. So given that there are these variety of aspects that we get to notice, we indeed have to try and work out ways and means by which we understand these stories that are present about different types of these places. One of the key aspects that we get to notice when it comes to, say, the understanding of space happens to be, one, the stories of the local areas that one speaks of. We call them as Sthala Purana. So there is one Sthala Purana that I felt it is appropriate to read it aloud to you, so that you might as well try and reflect on, say, what is being said. So this is the Sthala Purana of that important place that is the reason why we are actually talking about Rama Rājya today. This is the story of Rama-janmabhoomi. And here is one very fascinating legend, Sthala Purana, which has a great degree of connection with the kind of time and space relation and the memory and identity questions that we discuss. So please, and this is a reference that I'm taking from a work of a modern scholar. And there are, of course, say, the manners in which these have been accounted. You do find, say, modern day historians and onlookers of India who have tried to put together as much material as they could collect in terms of the traditional Indian way of looking at the world through their anthropological works. The story that I'm reading out is from a book by a scholar by name Peter van der Veer, who traveled through Ayodhya to collect these stories and has also written a few books, specifically speaking about the kind of relation between Indian religion and the sense of Indian nationalism and so on. So the Sthala Purana of Rama-janmabhoomi is as follows. The central place of Ramkot in Ayodhya is Rama-janmabhoomi, the birthplace of Ram. It was, of course, lost at the end of Treta Yuga, but it was rediscovered in our time by the famous king Vikramaditya. One question that I did state yesterday is that we are in 2021 Common Era, and this is equivalent to 2077 Vikrama era, and that Vikrama and this Vikrama are the same. But within the Indian tradition, when we actually look at the Constitution of India's illustrations, the reference to Vikramaditya's court comes as part of the golden age of modern history, which is referred to as the Gupta era. And that Vikramaditya is stated to be Chandragupta Vikramaditya II. That is the son of Samudragupta, which is actually referred to, because we know of the archaeological and epigraphical evidences of the Chandragupta Vikramaditya II. But that which is lost in time, or possibly the kind of legendary figure that we speak of this Vikrama, happens to be from the place of Mahakala, Ujjaini. So Vikrama of Vikram Samvat, or the Vikrama era, is the Vikramaditya who ruled the place of Mahakaleshwar, which is Ujjaini. So the story goes, so legend has it that this was the first place Vikramaditya managed to see when he went out to search for the place of Rama. Initially, all he knew about Ayodhya was that it was to be found on the bank of the river Sarayu. He made his camp and rode around on his horse. On one of his journeys, he came across a man on a black horse. He was dressed like a king, but totally black. Vikramaditya saw the man descending from his horse and taking a bath in the Sarayu. When he emerged from the Sarayu, this man had become totally white, to the utter astonishment of Vikramaditya. He drew his horse up in front of this stranger and asked him who he was and how he had changed from black to white. The man answered that he was Prayaga, the king of Tīrthas. We are all aware that, say, today this Prayaga is called as Prayagraj, and it is Tīrtharaj Prayag. And that he had become black by absorbing the sins of so many sinners. So we are all aware that the space of Prayaga, where the Triveni Sangama of Ganga, Saraswati and Yamuna is the place which is considered to be very, very sacred, and a dip in the Triveni Sangama is sufficient to wash off the sins of all the sins that a person carries in this life and possibly even that of previous lives. So given such a kind of important space that Teerthraj Prayag is given, and we find very many number of such stories that are specifically found in this specific mold that we find insofar as Thala Puranas are concerned. Now, by coming here and taking a bath, he had become white again. So Vikramaditya was naturally surprised that the most important Tīrtha, Tīrtharaja Prayaga, could wash his sins in this place, and so asked what kind of Mahima it was that made such a thing happen. So Prayaga answered that the place where they were standing was Gopratara, where Rama had left the mortal world. So as you are aware, Rama at the end of his avatara is stated to have drowned himself in Saryu. So that is the precise place where Prayaga has taken his dip. Vikramaditya was pleased to hear that he was now near Ayodhya, because it was on the banks of Saryu that Ayodhya was. And he asked if Prayaga knew more about the city. So the Tīrtharaja Prayaga showed all the sites, beginning with the place where Rama was born. Now Vikramaditya drew a line around it to make sure he would remember it. It's clear. So what did he do? He actually drew a line. So the point is, he has drawn this line, and to identify it later, he has drawn this line. Now, the point is, the story continues, however, and introduces a new element. Now, Vikramaditya was not able to find the line he had drawn to identify that place where Ram was born. So, dejected by this misfortune, he sought the help of a yogi who was in deep meditation nearby. When this yogi came out of his meditation, he told the Raja that it was not easy to realize the birthplace of Ram. Mere direction as to its geographical position would not suffice. Some special procedure was necessary, and that was the reason that Vikramaditya could not find his line again. And to understand this secret, or the rahasya of this birthplace of Rama, the Raja should constantly do a japa of Ramanama, Rama Mantra, and he should also let a calf together with other cattle roam in this area. When the calf came across the Rama-janmabhoomi, milk would drip immediately from its udders. As a result of such a demonstrative incident, no one could ever doubt that this was really the birthplace of Rama. The king did as he was told, and at midday on Sri Ram Navami, the calf began to shed milk at a certain place. And that is where Vikramaditya built a temple of with Saligrama, which Rama Saligrama, and he installed an image deity of infant Ram, Ramlalla, and it is the Sthala Purana goes on to say that Ramlalla, Ramlalji, was offered the puja by Brahmanas belonging to the Vasishta Gotra and of the Atharva Veda. So this is a brief story of the Ayodhya's Rama-janmabhoomi, and I've just pointed out a point about the Sthala Purana and the reference to Vikrama in this. That Vikrama, whose historical reference in current times is questioned. So if you look at the traditional approach to looking at the periodization of time, I have actually referred to Krita, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali. And within Kali Yuga, there are 6 epochs or epoch makers who are actually identified, of which the first is Yudhishthira, who ruled also into the first few years of the advent of Kali Yuga, and then Parikshit, whose story we have already heard briefly. Now, the person whose epoch is still followed in India, specifically in the North India and also in Nepal, is that of Vikrama of Ujjaini, who founded his era in terms of the common era, it was in the 57 BCE. So please remember that this Vikrama, according to modern historians, is a fictitious character who has been found as someone who is concocted by the Jyotishas of Ujjaini. And even to this day, some of you would be aware that the Indian almanac has a very important, the foundational place from where Indian almanac preparation happens is from Ujjaini. You would also find that, say, the kind of reference point, like we have the Greenwich in terms of the Greenwich Mean Time of the longitudes, is something that in earlier days used to start from Ujjaini. And those of you who happen to visit Ujjaini, you would actually notice a number of legends. And one very interesting place that one would also notice is that it also has the place of Mangaleshwara, that is the presiding deity of Mangalagraha, Mars. So those who do consider that they have Kuja dosha in their Janpatri, they, in order that, say, they overcome it, they do go and take a worship of Mangaleshwara. And one other key point that you would notice is when Maharaja Jaisingh, Savai Jaisingh II, was constructing Jantar Mantars in the country, he chose very specific areas where Jantar Mantars were built. And all those were very essential in terms of the Indian understanding of astronomy. And Ujjaini was one such place. So you have a Jantar Mantar at the current New Delhi. You have one in Jaipur. There's also one in Ujjaini. So the Ujjaini's ephemeris is very important in terms of understanding of our own calculations of time, which we can see a little later. But now let us get back to this specific point about the Epoch Makers. So the Indian Purana version of how the way in which past unfolded necessarily speaks of after Vikrama, his grandson Salivahana was the one who had his reign, and he established an epoch, and this epoch is said to last for 18,000 years out of the 432,000 years that we spoke of the Kali Yuga. Post that, of course, you have others who are stated to be the future epoch makers, and this work comes from a Jyotisha text attributed to Kalidasa. They say that this Kalidasa is different from the Kalidasa who was part of the Vikrama's court. Now, the Vikrama that I referred to is the one in whose court was were existent the Navaratnas, which the historians would like to map it onto the times of Chandragupta Vikramaditya II of the Gupta lineage. Now, this is a kind of critical difference in terms of the modern history's accounting of past and that what one would find from the Puranas. And the fact that, say, so central a ruler and also an epoch maker like Vikrama is considered as a fictitious figure insofar as the mainstream modern historical works is something that is attributable to the nature of historical method itself. And we'd actually need not focus on that part, but it suffices at this moment to start with the understanding that this difference is very significant. So if in the court of law, there is a presentation on Rama-janmabhoomi that says that there was a Bhavya Divya Mandir, which actually was the place where Ram Lalla was installed by Vikramarka, and this was the kind of temple which later got demolished, and today there is a desire to reconstruct that temple and so on. One must necessarily understand that the modern historical version actually doubts the very presence of such a Vikrama. Further, if you actually notice the kind of importance of Vikrama in terms of this, say, understanding of time and space of our own country, one would also have to identify that all the Panchangas of North India, they actually are referring to Vikram Samvat. Though there is also the other Samvat, which is called as the Salivahana Seka, which modern Indian nation also accepts. It is called the Shaka calendar. And if you happen to notice or type Indian national calendar in Google, you would actually be taken to the Government of India's website, where they actually say that all the gazettes of India, and also you would find this reference in All India Radio programs every day morning when they actually tell what is the date. They'll speak of a specific way in which mapping of the Gregorian calendar, the common calendar, has been made onto that of what was called as Indian national calendar, whose months are not the same as January, February, March, and so on, but instead they are Chaitra, Vaishakha, so Jeshtha. So this sequence of that which you get to see, Vaishakha, Jeshtha, what one finds in this is that the traditional Panchangas refer to the Chandramana calculations, the lunisolar calendar, and there is a specific way in which these Pancha Angas, Tithi, Vara, Nakshatra, Yoga, Karana, these 5 make up what we call as Pancha Anga of Panchanga. And it turns out that the modern Indian national calendar does not speak of tithis which are directly relevant to the manner in which we notice our the movement of the waxing and waning of the moon. Instead, the mapping would be Chaitra 1 is equated with the 22nd of March, which was actually the day of Yugadi of 1957. So from then on, it was standardized. And when it comes to a leap year, you would have an extra day. So that day, the point shall be that you will add, you will actually get the Ugadi on 21st of March. So you can actually take a look at this, and I'll share these details of what I'm telling you in my notes and the summary of what we have been doing. But it suffices to say that this exercise of trying to look at our own calendar and the reform of the calendar is a half-baked exercise, because the Indian national calendar never ever got prominence in the usage of people. That is the state of affairs. So, but then the Calendar Reform Committee and its report, which I can share for your further reading, is something which is very important, because that was one major effort that was indeed taken up and which requires due attention. Now, it also needs to be seen that the choice of Salivahana Seka over the Vikrama Seka to start with is also something that brings up a question, So if you look at the presence of Shalivahana, whether it is accepted by the modern historians, they would say that Shalivahana is somebody who must be taken to be the same as Shatavahanas. So Hala was a very famous Shatavahana. So that is one name that is taken. There is another name which also got made into a popular movie in Telugu, which also got possibly dubbed into Hindi by name Gautami Putra Shatakarni. So there is that other mapping which is done, that this Epoch Maker Shalivahana was the same as that of Gautami Putra Shatakarni. But the traditional version always clearly asserts that Shalivahana ruled from Ujjaini, and his epoch was started in Ujjaini. Now, the Shalivahana and Vikrama, these two mysterious figures, and their relation to what we today understand of as India in relation to the rest of the world is also very important. So one reference that one does get with respect to this is in Bhavish Purana, and wherein Vikramarka of Ujjaini is stated to have won over lands that actually extend up to the current day Arabia. So if one looks at the traditional way in which we speak of space, we have these, it is true that you also have this these multiple lokas. So there are 7 Utva lokas that are spoken of, 7 Adho lokas, so 14 in together. And when it comes to say the Mahi Mandala, in fact, some of you who may have heard the full rendition of Deshakala Sankirtana in whenever a puja is done, you would notice that it actually refers to Panchashat Koti Yojana Mahi Mandala, and within which there is a Lakshya Yojana Vistirna Jambu Dvipa. So there is a reference to Jambu Dvipa in there. And Jambu Dvipa is stated to have 9 Varshas in it, of which Bharata Varsha happens to be one. And again, Bharata Varsha, so you have Bharata Varsha, which is again say divided into khandas, of which Bharata Khanda is one. So current understanding is that what we today understand as the Asetu Sitachala, that is from the Himalayas to the Kanyakumari, the Rameswaram, the reference to Ramasetu, is something that is that land mass which is the Bharata Khanda, and the Bharata Varsha also included some parts of what we today know of as Iraq, some parts of Arabia, and so on. So that is a memory which is actually captured when one takes into account the point which is present with respect to the reference to Bharata Varsha. There are, of course, other Varshas that we come across, Kimpurusha Varsha and so on, all of which and their corresponding references in terms of modern day geographies have been speculated and also are a point which you do find several scholars refer to. Those details can be shared with you. But key point to notice is that the nature of geography that we today know of is in the sense in which, say, a few hundreds of years ago, Indians actually visualized the world in which we are present. So just as, say, the way in which time and its understanding has been, say, altered, the nature of space and also the manner in which the recognition of space also altered. And in specific reference to that of reading, say, the works that one finds, including in Ramayana, you'll find a remarkable description of the varieties of places that Sugriva traveled, because he invites, say, his friends from different parts of the world in order to help him in terms of searching for Sita. So there's an entire description there all of it, again, we do not have a very concrete understanding of what are all those places which are actually described in that. There are several scholars who have actually worked on it, and there are also possibly books which actually refer to it, all of which gives a completely different picture of how we start understanding the nature of the world around us. So the naming and the kind of background that it provides is a major issue. And I have actually brought to your attention two parts. One is that the Epoch Makers, Shalivahana and Vikrama, are no longer considered as historical beings. There's a great amount of work with respect to proving that Vikramarka was a historical person. And if you happen to go to Ujjaini, you might as well say visit a place called Maharaja Vikramaditya Shodhpeeth, exclusively founded about 10 years ago to show the specific instance of what we call as the historicity of Vikramaditya. There's a scholar whose work you would also find it online, where you might as well say look at the kind of evidences that are actually presented, but that is not yet mainstream in terms of its acceptance. This is something to be kept in mind, but we do not have any kind of great effort that happened with respect to what we consider as another important epoch maker, whose epoch started in 78 Common Era, Salivahana Seka, which is also part of the kind of Seka which the Indian national calendar accepts. Seka 1942. Yesterday, I actually mistook it to be 1943. Post Ugadi, it shall be 1943. It is, today shall be, according to that calendar, it will be Magha Krishna Pratipada of 1942, Salivahan Seka. So this is something that you might as well want to be aware of, and that indeed actually poses several questions about how we shall understand the sense of the varieties of Sthala Puranas that we are actually aware of. So this is part one of our understanding of space, but I also refer to these Urdhvalokas and Adholokas. So even if, say, one actually sets aside that there are these 7 lokas and each of it having different kinds of descriptions and so on, the acceptance of just 2 of them, Iha and Para, actually are sufficient for us to as well deal with many things. So sense of past is something that actually is directly relevant in terms of how we order our own activities in the present. So this is something that I have been trying to repeatedly say. So one of the kind of things that you found as a cultural value, which is instilled in Indian people for a long time, which because of the advent of quote unquote modernity, we do not see its presence as strongly as it used to be earlier, is that people acted in a manner in which they reckoned that the actions that they do in the present are not for receiving immediate rewards, but it is to ensure that they have an ascent in the Paraloka. I'll repeat this. The effort of human being in the present is not to ensure that there is a reward for the kind of actions that one does in the present, but it is actually something that is desirous of an ascent in the Paraloka, not Ihaloka, but the Paraloka, is a essential kind of a cultural value that you find even to this day practiced by several people, but not as a general cultural trait that used to be in earlier times. So the removal of the Paraloka as an important element in terms of what we actually get to see in current world is a very important aspect that one cannot say forget in terms of how one actually sees the human action in the present. Now, question is, if one looks at Mahabharata, there are specific shlokas which clearly indicate that nobody knows whether there indeed is actually something called as Paraloka, which is different. One cannot possibly establish that such a Paraloka exists. But the key point that is also stated is that in spite of one not being able to establish such a thing, act as if it were existent. And this is a value system which indicated that if in case it indeed existed, and there is a possibility that such an ascent which is spoken of in Shastras, which cannot possibly be established except by, say, accepting Shastra as it is, because Shastra itself is a pramana. That is, it is something that is to be taken to be true. So given that this is a formulation that exists, so how does one actually understand Paraloka in a world today where everything has to be understood with respect to what we call as the scientific modality of looking at what is acceptable and what is not? This is a kind of a value system which a change which occurred specifically on account of modernity, whose details we shall see in our next session. But the fact that, say, Paraloka as an important element does not actually play a role in terms of our current activities and action is an important element that needs to be seriously reflected on. If only in every act of ours we actually try to see what would our action be if at all we accept a Paraloka. It's a thought experiment that one can actually do for oneself to see what I am doing right now. Is it going to lead an ascent in the other world? So question then would be, how would you understand the ascent? And then comes the question of trying to see who are the people who have actually spoken of and what are the kind of things that are actually specifically referred to. So as a value system, to actually say that acting on those kind of things where you clearly see that the kind of benefit that you gain out of it is known as something which is inferior, as opposed to that of a sense where one would actually refer to a point of acting on such things whose consequence is not known. The balance of say the kind of weight which is accorded to that of that which we would consider as the consequence that is unknown is more and is important. So this is a value system that I do believe that one must, say, keep in mind in terms of our reference to the sense of past which is relevant in the context of Rama Rājya, because how else can one explain the point of what we today refer to as that remarkable decision of Rama to go to the forest for 14 years for the sake of a word given by his father. There were extensive debates that one does find within the scope of Ramayana, where Rama was advised not to actually leave the kingdom. And in fact, one of the arguments which is clearly shown to be that of a Nastika is that for a Raja, it actually does not matter even if he ends up killing his father and occupying the throne, because he has the people behind him. So there are of the very few instances that one finds Rama getting extremely angered. This is one such instance that one finds within the Ramayana itself, and it speaks volumes. So we can actually refer to these in our later sessions. Now, how do we understand Paraloka in the present is a question that I posed. And this is one place where Professor Navjyoti actually tried to give a very insightful response. And the kind of reference that I think requires to be brought to your attention is, we actually started this course by referring to Bhishmacharya and also paying a tribute to him because we started on the Bhishmashtami. And Bhishma's relevance to our country is very significant. And when Bhishma was requested to actually teach Rajadharma to Yudhishthira, Sri Krishna was asked by Bhishmacharya, well, you are Jagadguru yourself. So why is it that you insist that I be the one to convey this? So of the many kind of responses that Sri Krishna gave to this question of Bhishma, he said that I have been actually thinking about how is it that I can ensure that you become immortal. And having thought of it, so this is Vasudeva Vacha. Yavati pratate loke purushasya yasho bhuvi tavat tasya akshayam sthanam bhavati iti vinischita. So this is a point which Sri Krishna said, Vasudeva stated, and this is something that is strongly believed as well in the kind of society that we live in even today. What does it mean? It says that so long as, we've already accepted that death is a constant factor that that is present for and accepted by people of all kinds of thought processes in the world. So what happens post-death, and how is it that one remembers a person post one's death or in one's absence? That is a key question that one might as well want to be aware of. And if at all a person is actually sung pious post his death, then such a person is certainly going to have a place in the ascending world of Parloka, of the other world. So where exactly would the discussion of the deeds or the kind of actions that a person has done in the present is placed in terms of the modern understanding of the world that we today know of? And here, if one looks at, say, one of the key kinds of constructions which happened since Immanuel Kant is a specific reference to what we today call as public space. We've already seen that the idea of secular, that the modern understanding of secularism has been thought of as a separation between public and the private. So that which is public is something that can actually happen in the presence of large number of people in an open recording like this, where, say, if this is put up on YouTube, it becomes a public thing. If at all it is left for discussion, there's a description of, say, public space and the modern day reference to what we know of as enlightenment of the European kind. So European enlightenment and public space have a very strong interlinking. I do intend to share a brief article, an essay by Immanuel Kant called What is Enlightenment, which is a very good read in terms of understanding the kind of public space argument that is placed. So the point is, public space is that kind of a space where any person stating anything, for that matter, is something that requires to be shown to be rationally defensible. If you do not have a rational defense of something, then such a kind of a thing does not have a space in public space. It's something that can be relegated to private space of one's own belief. But if it has to have some value, then there is a public space argument that one must indeed carry. Now, the praise of a person's actions in the public space is that which ensures that the ascent of a person's presence in the Paraloka is a point which Professor Navjyoti tried to bring out. And he says that the act of trying to ensure that the career not in the Ihaloka, but the career in the Paraloka is advanced by one's deeds in the present is something that actually one gets to notice, not when one person is present and alive, but possibly when one is no longer present, that is, it may not be the case that he passed away, but even in the present, in the absence of the person right in front. So supposing that, say, I were to talk of someone who is not present here. Let's say today I intend to recall what Rabindranath Tagore said. Now, Rabindranath Tagore, the moment, say, I take the name, each of you who has read Rabindranath Tagore would have your own impression of what his persona is. That recollection of that persona is actually present in the public space. And so long as that kind of a thing is actually looked up and seen in terms of a very positive light, then such is a time when we do expect that such a person is actually in the say Paraloka, he is existent and he has Akshaya Sthana. That is, it's not going to diminish. It is imperishable till that time, till this trace of that person is still present. Now, this is an insight which I wouldn't say is entirely traditional, but certainly the very useful in terms of imagining how one can actually think of Paraloka and its relevance in terms of our arguments in the present. This is one conception that I intend to bring to your attention. And we have in a previous discussion actually spoken of the names of India. The first article of the Constitution of India spoke of as India, that is Bharat, is a union of states. So there was a point about why not Bharat, why India, and so on. And each of these names do carry great degree of meaning. So there are actually, I am fortunate to have come across an entire work, which is possibly one of its kind in post-independent era, called Desh Ke Abhidhan, Bharat, Hindu or India. So the reference to Hindu there is because India was also called as Hindustan. And that reference necessarily makes that, say, one must actually learn about what is this reference to Hindu. And there is one important point that is actually made with respect to the name Bharata, which I did refer to earlier, but now I intend to read out that specific shloka which comes in Vayu Purana. Bharanacha prajanam vai manur bharata uchyate nirukta vachanachaiva varsham tat bharatam smritam. So Manu is stated to be the first ruler of the world that we live in, that we reside in. And since he was somebody who has done Prajabharana, manner in which he has actually taken up the proper way in which one could actually be looked after. So he has done Prajabharana, because of which he was called as Bharata, and that kind of territory which was ruled over by Bharata is known as Bharata. And later we also come to know that Daushyanti Bharata, that is Dushyanta and Shakuntala and Dushyanta's son, Bharata, also ruled in that manner in which this legendary Manu's presence is spoken of. And that Manu, that Daushyanti Bharata's name is what actually gave this territory that we reside in as Bharata. That is one name. And the key point again to be noticed is that when we speak of Bharata today, we also have a reference to Bharatamata, which is again a very, in fact, if one goes to Varanasi, you will also find a place called Bharatamata Mandir. There is a Bharatamata is a deity. She is not just the entity or the kind of territory that one speaks of, but there is something of greater value that one notices. And this particular approach of trying to consider a country as a mother figure and also see it as a deity, this kind is something which is very unique to India. One may find that, say, there are references where people say that Russians would talk of their own country as fatherland. Germany also refers to their country as fatherland. And you have such many references, but nowhere you would find the being of the territory in which one resides is actually imagined as an embodied person, and that embodied person is someone who is also to be revered. This notion is very specific to Indian mind, and that is also a unique thing that one must as well try and understand to actually make sense of how one understands, say, the possibility of Rama Rājya in current times. I would like to bring to your attention that when we refer to this particular notion of the embodiment as a person and a deity, this isn't something which is only with respect to Bharata as the Asetu Sitachala that we are speaking of. If one refers to, say, a river like Ganga, she again is seen as an embodied deity. So Devi Ganga is what is referred to. It is equally true of Yamuna. So there is something that is added more to it. And this becomes something which is unique to the Indian mind. And this is something which is also part of the sense of past that people carry. If at all you find that you go to a place where Ganga flows and you find people doing puja unto the river, that's something which is happening as if it is a routine thing. The sense of past is actually to be observed in what one does routinely. It's not something that has to be, say, something that one has to read up and then, say, acquire. Because there are, but then, say, specifically when we direct it to a certain kind of activity, like in this instance, we are looking at towards realizing Rama Rājya, then we, of course, require to know certain things more than what we would normally do, because we all carry a certain type of sense of past. But key point is, this particular specific instance that we are referring to of trying to look at Ganga as a deity, doing a puja there, and how is it that actually it maps on to all kinds of activities that we do? What do we abstract this as? So this is something that if one looks at our own tradition, there is a specific term for it, and we refer to it as Adhidaivata Dharana. See, when it comes to the world that we refer to, there are three kinds of realms that are spoken of. We refer to Adhibhuta, Adhidaiva, and Adhyatma. Now, there are, say, translations of it to English, all of which do not do justice to these three terms. I'll certainly share, say, a document which gives what Bhishmacharya told Yudhishthira about how does one understand these three, which will actually clarify and rather pose more questions also. But this sense of Adhidaivata Dharana is a very important aspect when it comes to the understanding of the space that, or any rendition of space that Indians have. The point that, say, see, this is something that you do find the Western scholars recognized when they actually started speaking of India as a sacred geography. So there's a book by that name itself, India as a Sacred Geography. And you would notice that, say, the sacredness of Kashi is so very important that you do find, say, people speak of Uttar Kashi, people speak of Dakshin Kashi. So there is a specific reference to Ganga, and in the Dakshina, when one refers to Kaveri as Dakshina Ganga. So this kind of associations and the kind of mapping that is made in terms of the mind of people is a very important aspect of trying to shape the nature of how one relates to the world around, and specifically very unique to the culture of Bharata. So Adhidaivata Dharana, in terms of a very contemporary activity that we at Purna Pramati were very fortunate to have witnessed, is that of the great Ganga Tapasya of Swami Gyanswarup Sanand, a point which some of you may be aware of, but if you are not, I'd certainly say request you to look up what Swami Gyanswarup Sanand did in terms of going on to a fast unto death and in due process also giving up his mortal body for the sake of the uninterrupted flows in the 6 source streams of Ganga. And he had a very important point to say: if we do not actually have a sense of Adhidayavata Dharana with respect to Ganga, and look at Ganga as yet another river which is a source of trying to provide us with whatever our desires and fulfilling our desires are concerned, then in what manner can we ever recognize the true Adhyatma sense of what Ganga actually represents? So that's a question that he did pose, which requires very strong attention, specifically so in our quest for quote unquote realizing Rama Rājya, because Ramo Vigrahavan Dharmaha is something that is stated to say that Rama is an embodiment of Dharma, and Vigraha is actually a solid. But if one were to actually imagine the liquid form of Dharma, then it takes the shape of Ganga. This is also something that we get to see in terms of the kind of Ganga Prashasti that we get to listen to. So Ganga is Dharma Dravam. So the Adhidayavata Dharana that one carries isn't something which one can as well say set aside, thinking that say it is something which is speaking of some Devta, a Devta who we don't believe in. So that is something which is besides the point. Now, I certainly want to bring to your attention that the imagination of the time and space, when they actually keep in mind the sense of Paraloka on one side and the sense of Adhidayavata Dharana on the other, and try and imagine what shall be the kind of activities that one does take up in the light of these two senses, then one can necessarily say that that kind of action which actually keeps these two in mind cannot but be Dharma. I'd certainly like to repeat this. Many people would have a question as to what Dharma is. Now, Dharma, even if it were taken to be religion, every religion does not just restrict itself to this world that we see. It speaks of the other world. It says that if you do not act well here, then say there will be a consequence, and that consequence could be very terrible or very good or bad, depending on say the nature of action that one does in the present. And it has a consequence that even if you do not actually experience it now, there will be a time in the other world that you get to experience it. What that other world is, different religions might have different kind of formulations. But the fact that say this Paraloka is something that is taken to be true isn't something that one needs to take only religious people as being concerned if we start accepting the possibility of Paraloka as public space, because even an atheist or an agnostic would indeed have a kind of a desire to say that, well, in the absence of the person, a person is actually talked about in glowing terms rather than in demeaning terms. So that's a desire that society can as well try and instill. How would you ensure that the commonplace notion of who to praise and who not to praise, if at all it is something that is ingrained in a culture in a manner in which one can as well see that in alignment with the kind of tremendous wisdom that we as a people carry from our entire past, then we indeed have a kind of great opportunity to try and speak of this, say, reference to Paraloka as a great kind of beginning to start and align our activities in terms of Dharma. So that does not even call for, say, a great degree of memorizing of the kind of past injustices. What indeed it calls for is a desire that is actually placed in future, and a commonplace scenario where people praise such actions which are actually known to be something that are worthy of praise. So our focus of trying to think of a Rama Rājya would actually become something which is about what are the kind of actions that are deserving of praise. So that's a question that one can actually reflect on. It's something which does pose, and since public space is a space where rationality is something that is to be upheld, then it also poses the question of what types of rationalities exist. I think it is relevant to as well bring to your attention that within the Western tradition itself, we have scholars like Alastair MacIntyre, who spoke of whose justice, which rationality, trying to contrast the rationality of Plato as different from that of Aristotle, as different from that of Thomas Aquinas, and so on. So that poses serious questions for reflection, which also opens up the way in which we can look at the nature of the world around us, and in turn create spaces for reflection beyond, say, what we currently see as the kind of diminutive space of public reflection. So that is one point that I felt is very important to bring to your attention. So Bharata, as that which has this Adhidevata Dharana, if it cannot possibly say bring this to the fore, then possibly we do not have great possibility of this kind of thing happening elsewhere. And if there is a lot of talk about Vishwaguru that people do indeed speak of, then it is by picking on these kind of threats which are still open that one could as well think of. And in that sense, the kind of relation that one has to establish between Ganga and Rama is something that is very important. And in current times, if one speaks of one place where there is an agreement between modern scholars of the left and also the dharmic gurus or the religious people, it turns out to be the environmental issues. That the possibilities within the way in which one can actually refer to how development can happen, because the notion of development and the nature of nationalism are also very keenly related. We shall as well see how this came about once we start looking at the questions of modernity and the desire for modernity, because desire for modernity and desire for quote-unquote development, modern development, are actually very strongly related. We come to those questions, but it suffices to say that the time and space issues that we currently have, if it actually keeps in mind the point that, say, nature of time is something that is not bound by the notions, but it has a sense in which values that are spoken of in Krita, Treta, Dwapara, Kali, and space which also takes into account Paraloka. Even if Paraloka were to be treated just as public space, we have a wholly different kind of formulation within which discussions and discourse can happen. So that is a submission that I intend to make before concluding this session. And there are, say, quite a few points that one can as well refer to when once this clarity goes in, we can now possibly start looking at, say, what Mahabharata, Ramayana, or various Puranas. And with this eye, if one actually looks at all the various religious texts, it also gives us a different insight of how one can as well try to learn from them. So I'd certainly be glad to take a few questions before we can, say, conclude the session for today.
Thank you, Pranavji. Any questions? You can either ask or type your questions in the chat box.
So if it might take a few more minutes to take this question, I'd like to explain, say, the background to the to this course's background note. The I'm actually sharing this this tab for your viewing, where I do intend to want to speak of these shlokas which are actually given. The first one from Vishnu Purana speaks of Gayanti Devaha Ilagitakani Dhanyastu te Bharata Bhumi Bhage Swargapa Vargas Padamarga Bhute Bhavanti Bhuyah Purushaha Suratvat. So what is this that it is indicating? This is one of the very famous shlokas which is actually referred to in praise of the Bharatavarsha, the land that we are all residing in. It doesn't actually restrict itself to the Bharata Khanda. It's actually Bharatavarsha itself. So the point is that those people who are actually born in this land, they are so fortunate that the Devatas, who are immortal because of their drinking of Amrita, also feel that we aren't as fortunate as people in here, because we who are here in Swarga cannot actually think of a liberation from where we are in. We are stuck here. Whereas people who are born in the Bharata Bhumi, they have access to all the four Purusharthas: Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. So moksha and the possible liberation from the cycle of birth and rebirths is something that is possible by being born on this land, and which is one reason why, say, people of this land are truly dhanya. They are people who are remarkably endowed, and whether they recognize it or not, this is the case. So such is the way in which Devatas sing of. So then there is a series of shlokas which are from the Bhishma Parva that are also important to be recognized. This is, you could say, Bharata Sankirtana. Atrate Kirtayishyami Varsham Bharata Bharatam Priyam Indrasya Devasya Manor Vaivasvatasya Cha. So the context in Mahabharata, when these pions of Bharata Bhumi come, when Dhritarashtra asks Sanjaya to narrate what is it that is the greatness of Bharatavarsha. Please note that what all I am going to read out right now isn't something that one finds in modern historical textbooks. There's not a single historical character that you would probably find within this scope. So the kind of, because these are, these kind of people who are referred to in here, they actually come in the cosmic time only. So I've actually referred to the history itihasa question in my previous session. So Priyam Indrasya Devasya. So Indra, the lord of Devatas, he finds that Bharatavarsha is, we've already seen that the Devatas actually sing paeans of this place, because Devatas do not have the possibility of attaining moksha, whereas people here do have. And it is something that is actually of great, the kind of favor that this land is shown is also by several rulers of yore, Manu to begin with, and amongst the Manus, this particular Manvantara, the Manu is Vaivasvata Manu. Pruthostu Rajan Vainyasya Tatha Ikshvakor Mahatmanaha Yayate Rambarishasya Manthatur Nahushasya Cha. Here there are references to a few rajas Prithu, who is the son of Vena. So if one actually has to refer to foundations of Rajaniti Shastra in India, then one has to actually look at the story of Vena and the story of Prithu. So Prithu is the one in whose name this Bhumi got also the name Prithvi. So because Prithu ruled Bhumi as if she were his own daughter. So Prithvi name comes from the reign of Prithu. Yayati, Ambarisha, Mandhata, Nahusha. These are the other names, those great. So Prithu, Ikshvaku, Yayati, Ambarisha, Mandhata, Nahusha. These are the rulers who are referred to. Tatha eva Muchukundasya Shibirau Shibihi Aushinarasya cha. So Ushinara's son Shibi, Muchukunda, Rishabhasya. So Rishabha is this Rishabha is also the founder of is the first amongst the 24 Jain Tirthankaras. Rishabhasya Tatha Ailasya Nrigasya. So Ila's son is actually referred to in here, Aila. Nrigasya Nripates Tatha. So these are all the rulers that are referred to. Kushikasya cha. Kushika, say Kaushika is the name of Viśvamitra. Then you have Durdharsha, Kushikasya cha Durdharsha Gadhescheva Mahatmanaha. So these are people who are exceptionally strong rulers. So Gadhi. Gadhi Putra is Viśvamitra. So Gadhi is referred to. Somakasya cha Durdharsha Dilipasya tathaiva cha. Dilipa from the Raghuvamsa is referred to. Somaka is referred to. Anyeshancha Maharaja Kshatriyanam Baliyasam Sarveshameva Rajendra Priyam Bharata Bharatam. So these are the legendary kings that one gets to actually listen to. The stories of these legendary kings actually played a major role in terms of the sense of past that was carried by a great king of historical times by name Sri Krishnadevaraya. So if one actually happens to look at the works of Sri Krishnadevaraya, one of the lost works of Sri Krishnadevaraya turns out to be Sakala Katha Sara Sangraha. This was written in Sanskrita, and it is stated that, in fact, we only have a fragment of it that is today available, wherein amongst the writings of Sri Krishnadevaraya, it is in this that he refers to Vyasaraja as his guru. So we were fortunate to start this entire session by reference with the invocation and blessings of the current Peethadipati of Vyasaraja Peetham, Sri Vidya Sri Tīrtha Svāmī-ji. So that, say, a person like Sri Krishnadevaraya, whose reign is very popularly praised in current times, felt it appropriate to speak of Sarvakatha Sarasangraha, whose contents are actually estimated to be the stories of the Shat Chakravartin, the 6 Chakravartis who ruled the entire world, and Shodasa Maharaja, of which Ambarisha, Yayati, Mandhata, these are all amongst Dilipa, all these are amongst those 16 Maharajas that are actually referred to. So a question would be, amongst these, so amongst the people who are listening to this lecture, how many names have you heard, and do you know the story of what is the greatness of each of these great kings who felt it their privilege to have ruled over this Bharatavarsha? So this is the first section of it, and in the end, it is very importantly stated, Yatha gunabalam cha api trivargasya mahaphalam dukhyeta dhenuhu kamadhuk bhumihi samyak anushtita. So what is being stated in here in the Bharata Sankirtana is that a ruler or whoever is in a position of power to try and influence the manner in which this great Bharatavarsha is governed, with when they are actually, say, properly governing it, then this is that kind of a land which provides Trivarga, that is Dharma, Artha, and Kama. It satisfies everybody. And in what manner? It actually gives in the manner in which Kamathenu, the celestial cow, which actually gives anything that one asks for. So it actually gives the best of milk in manners in which one can't even imagine. And so this is that land whose paeans are sung as stating that we do indeed deserve kind of governance which actually has a memory of these great rulers who are actually not possibly part of the historical memory. And therefore, say, the only person that we get to see in that sequence happens to be Rama. So that Rama is referred to amongst these is a question that one does indeed have to speak of. So this is something that I intend to bring to your attention. And this memory also is carried in Arthashastra of Kautilya, which is often referred to. Kautilya actually refers to what were the kind of mistakes that some of these rulers have done, which needs to be avoided in future. So, for example, one of these great rajas by name Pururava, who was a Chakravarti, one of the 6 Chakravartis. So Pururava is stated to have lost the favor of his people because he taxed the people a lot more than what he ought to. So taxation system, which actually is something which is burdensome, is something that is not expected of somebody who is a good person governing the country. So these are things that I thought I must bring to your attention. I see that I have some good questions. So my good friend Aziz has a few points. He asks a question: is the Bharatavarsha blessings applicable to Lord Rama and Krishna in which they took avatars? Indeed, yes. Did they attain all 4 forms? And I mean the 4 Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha? Answer is yes. See, the point again to be noticed is that the avatara as a notion is itself that requires attention. So Rama and Krishna, the moment we accept that they are lording over the world, they are the ones who actually provide one with, or say they are the givers of the phala. So the manner in which Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha are to be enjoyed by people. And one reference that we do get to know from the what was Rama Rājya question is that all the people who lived in Rama Rājya, they were actually bestowed to enjoy the Artha and Kama that they desired. And that was because they were impelled to act as per Dharma. And I do intend to share a short essay which actually describes what was Rama Rājya, where this is written by Swami Karpatriji, who points out to one instance that in Rama Rājya, spies were actually going around and they overheard a mother who was struggling to give milk to her young one. So this young boy was actually not wanting to drink milk. And then the mother says, "My dear child, this is the opportunity for you to actually have the nectar of my breast. Because if you do not take it now in this birth, after this, you would not have the option to actually be born again, to have the blessing of having the nectar of mother's breast." So this is a very beautiful kind of a formulation, which one can as well say understand that if one were to actually think of what is the kind of enjoyment that one can actually refer to in Rama Rājya, then there is a rasa swadhana that one has to speak of, and this rasa is both in terms of what one tastes in the with our tongue and also with our manas. So you have all the navarasas that would have to be spoken of. So Rama and Krishna were actually giving these because the moment you accept them to be the ones who are lording, they, specifically in the case of Rama, he indeed, because he was to provide an exemplar as to how a ruler ought to live, he was ready to take it upon himself to even suffer in order to ensure that the values that he felt are important to be upheld in the society, they must be. So to actually have a ruler of the kind of Rama is something that one never actually finds it to be easy. All the kind of rulers, if one looks at the very initial senses in which Rajaniti Shastra is spoken of in say Mahabharata as well as in other places, every Raja would indicate, including Bhishma, they say that the act of being a Raja is full of burden. It's a crown of thorns, and it is indeed a crown of thorns because if at all you are adjudicating in a wrong manner, then that papa is going to accrue to you. There's a fine story that one must actually notice is that in the Swargarohana Parva, Yudhishthira is to visit the hell, Naraka, first, before he can go to Swarga. That is because every ruler, with their knowledge, conscious knowledge or otherwise, they might have done something which would have possibly hurt the kind of ensuring or the establishment of dharma, because Raja Kalasya Karanam is what we have actually already noticed. So the kind of burden that is actually resting on the person who is ruling is immense, and therefore to actually carry it forward isn't something which is a easy thing. And only a person who is actually aware of this burden would even think of, say, what all is actually present in terms of the kind of act that one were to pick up. So do we have actually such a reference in our modern times? One would certainly have to say that the being of Mahatma Gandhi, for all his faults, actually had a sense of what this burden meant. And one can give, say, and this statement is defensible, in spite of all his faults in terms of the kind of decisions that he took, he did have a sense of, say, the kind of immenseness of the kind of burden that needs to be shouldered. So on the question of did they attain all four forms and finally moksha, when they are the ones who are actually bestowing it, then you wouldn't actually expect them to be the ones to say enjoy the same. But they being the embodiment, so what Rama did is dharma, and what Krishna stated is dharma, is how, say, we find the stories to be understood. Though of course in Bengal we had a person like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyaya tried to give a fresh direction in his book on Krishnavatara, because Bengalis have a greater favor towards Krishna in the recent times than Rama. Though of course the first literary work in Bengal happens to be of Krittivas Ocha, Ramayana by Krittivas Ocha. So on that question, the Bharatavarsha's blessings applicable to Lord Rama and Krishna, I do have to say that at one point in time, Rama got a question: why is it that the kind of dynasty that I am actually part of is not named after me? A very relevant question, because Rama is called as Raghukula Tilaka. but we still refer to it as Raghuvamsha, not as Ramavamsha. So what was the reason? So this is a question that did come to Rama. This is one of the various stories that we get to listen to from amongst the kind of poetic reconstructions that one can actually come across. So Rama possibly also had this ahankara that I am this great. So why is it that the dynasty itself be named after me? So it turns out that Rama's guru, sage Vasishta, was actually passing through, and since he was aware of reading the mind of others, and he could as well grasp what was going on in the mind of Rama, and there's a response that he gave. He said, Rama, for the sake of somebody who has abducted your wife, you've actually waged a huge war, created such huge destruction, and then won your wife back by showing your valor. Such is the kind of thing that you did. But if you actually think of your own ancestor, Raghu Maharaja, he was somebody who was actually ready to forego his own wife because one of his peoples was actually desirous of his wife. So the kind of mamakara that you carry wasn't something that was there in Raghu Maharaja. So naturally, this dynasty shall be named after that person who has conquered not just ahankara, that is the self-centered and the sense in which, say, one would look at one's own self, versus that of mamakara. Because you see, one might as well say that I am ready to face all kinds of pain, but I would not let my own children or my own wife face any kind of pain or any kind of suffering. So the sense of the attachment to one's own wife and children is much stronger than that of the sense in which one carries with respect to one's own self. So that sense in which, say, ego of a person is something that gets subdued in favor of doing a protection or favor to those that one likes. So that way, mamakara is much stronger than that of ahankara, is a point that I was fortunate to read this account in one of the reconstructions and the fascinating novels of Kavi Samrat Vishwanath Satyanarayana, because it poses a question. Whether or not it happened is a different story. But the question of why isn't that Rama Vamsha is not how we remember the dynasty of Rama, but instead as Raghuvamsha, would indeed call for us to understand what would be the greatness of Raghu Maharaja as opposed to that of Rama. So without the blessings of the kind of ancestors that Rama had, he couldn't have possibly, say, even led the kind of or say the kind of example that he could lead. And in Ramayana, you do find a reference of Mandhata that Rama makes in terms of deciding what course of action he had to take. I hope, Ashish, that this answers, say, your question. There's a second question, but it is about, is there a possibility for one in India to be dharmic without the belief in rebirths or reincarnation, as it seems something that is not in one's experience? Okay, so more than the belief in rebirth, the acceptance of Paraloka is important. Because if you say that your rebirth is actually in the memories of others, so I am not actually seeing Professor Navjyoti today, but I can remember him, and it is in my memory that he is still alive. So since I have actually referred to the Paraloka and reference to Paraloka as a public space possibility, even if one doesn't accept the rebirth, which is one reason why I said that Professor Navjyoti's formulation isn't what you would find as the traditional formulation, but in terms of trying to understand where we are, to look at, say, public space as a kind of space in which one can talk of as the place where our entire career ought to actually place itself in. So what kind of a memory would one like to have when one is not right in front? Or even the case where, suppose you actually look at a person, there are certain memories that come to your mind. What kind of memories would those would you like those to be? That question itself can possibly enable the possibility of thinking of dharma in the present. So even if one not accepts reincarnation or a rebirth and so on, this question at least opens up a space to speak of dharma, because it does actually speak of something which is beyond the here and now. That is the point that I felt is important to be brought to your attention. And this is acceptable to even the agnostics and atheists that one can as well find in the world. So you would find that, say, several people would start speaking of there are long-term consequences to our actions, so therefore we need to think of climate change and so on. These are the kind of talks that we get to hear. So in what manner can one actually start appreciating this? Because here nobody is speaking of rebirth. They are actually speaking of future generations. And that the future generation should not think bad of us as people who have been very self-centered, very selfish. And this is the kind of slogan that one finds. So in this quest, there is a possibility of trying to find some kind of aspects of dharma, though it won't be something that completely, say, addresses the question, because that would not actually be able to talk of the way in which the story of Prithu tells us that he was able to punish Bhudevi for not actually giving the fruits of the kind of efforts that his people were making. So agriculture is something where if one looks at Shastras, agriculture is not something which can be talked of as something where there's a labor that is done by the farmer. The labor is actually done by the land and the plants. And the farmer is actually a trader who takes that and provides a conducive condition for the work of the plants and the land to happen. And then he goes about doing it. So if one were to think of, say, the question of the current day farmer crisis and so on, it might as well be meaningful to actually recognize that farmer is to be treated as a Vaisya in the Chaturvarnya. And farmer as a Vaisya would mean that, say, his trade, and he also has a task that needs to be looked after, which is one of the obligations that is concerned, that is he's given with, which is the cattle rearing. So that combination would possibly, say, open up a different kind of way in which one can understand where we are currently placed. So is there a possibility for one in India to be dharmic without the belief in rebirths or reincarnation? Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, say, there are possibilities where you can try and explore, and you might be doing some things which are also in acceptance of what Dharma Shastras or the Shastra would indicate. And no, because you wouldn't be pretty sure that what you're doing can indeed be called dharmic. I hope that actually addresses that question.
I think I think we are running out of time, but still, I think that is, the discussion is very interesting. I think we can have one or a couple of more questions if anyone has. If anyone would like to raise a doubt, or shall we close this session?
So I do want to make a few points clear. So what we have actually done yesterday and today are still, say, the tip of what can be explored within, say, the scope of time, space, memory, identity questions. I tried to, say, bring in, or rather, say, cram in as much as I could in a manner in which we can move further towards the specific question and the objective of the course. So in which there are some kinds of thoughts which are relevant and which require to be addressed, and that has been the kind of focus within which, say, this is placed. And as the course note actually indicates, we are actually in quest of that kind of samyak anusthana of governance in the country, which can actually indeed turn this great land we are all born in to be that Kamadhenu that shall as well provide us with all that we ask for, and also without any kind of harm done unto herself. So that is a kind of desire, and if we can as well say explore in terms of what we can do in that direction, then we can say that we are on course towards realizing Rama Rājya.
Okay, so on that note, let us end this. Let us conclude today's session. We will meet next week, and I'll let you know about the timings. I think Pranavji will be writing a brief note on the quintessence of both the sessions, and we will mail the gist of both the sessions to all of you. Is that right, Pranavji? We shall be sending an email.
In fact, I also would be sending a few articles which are good to read, and greater participation is possible when, say, those write-ups are also read.
Great. Thank you very much for all your time and patience in listening to this very thought-provoking ideas by Pranavji. Hopefully, we will have much more in coming weeks. Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayah, sarve bhadrani paschyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet. Jai Shri Ram. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.